I think there tends to potentially be some stigma or some reactions when we talk about 12 steps and
Hmm.
maybe addressing things like that. So I'd love it
Yeah.
if you'd like dive a little bit into that. Like, why do you think some people might hesitate to get into
Yes.
12 step recovery?
Oh, I could say lots of things about this. So let me just kind of channel and say what's coming, because I am a person in long-term recovery. I have over 17 years of sobriety from drugs and alcohol, and the 12-step path was vital in getting me started. I am open and honest in saying it's not the only thing that's helped me to stay sober and really get well. That when I had about 2 years of recovery on that path, I needed to get into some pretty hardcore trauma counseling for myself. And then I eventually developed practices like yoga and meditation that helped me to sustain and grow in recovery. So I guess I should answer the question by first explaining my position that I am pro 12 steps, but I do not believe 12 steps are a panacea. I don't believe they're the be all and end all. And there are a lot of both professionals and people in 12-step recovery who can give the 12 steps a bad name by acting like the 12 steps are a panacea,
Mhm.
or that they're the one size fits all cure to everything. And so as a result, a lot of people, particularly on the trauma mental health side of this issue, and people who really rail against the 12 steps, can come at it with some legitimate criticisms for sure, that, oh, 12 steppers think it's one size fits all and you have to use God in order to get sober, and they use horribly outdated words like powerless and character defects. And I even say in my work that a lot of those criticisms are well founded, but likely because you've encountered a group or an individual or a series of individuals who's very rigid and dogmatic. So a little bit of the perspective is there are trauma and mental health counselors and leaders who I've interacted with in my work who look at me kind of suspiciously because I support the 12 steps. And I've long seen myself as somebody who's a both and person anyway. And especially on this issue, I really do try to live in the middle of these two worlds, that you can be pro 12 step and use the 12 steps in a way that can serve your recovery or your wellness goals, but also recognize that they're not the whole answer, particularly when unhealed trauma is involved. And this is where even what the 12 step programs would call outside help would be needed. And a lot of people may choose to pursue more counseling and trauma focused care as their route, but maybe use the 12 steps as some ancillary self help. I mean, that there's a lot of different ways the 12 steps can be implemented.
Mhm.
And I believe, like any discussion we have, wherever you run into problems is where you tend to see a rigidity or a dogmatism around how it's used. And then obviously a big criticism of the 12 steps is the whole emphasis on higher power or God, and how for a lot of people, especially if religious or spiritual trauma has been a part of their path, that won't work. And I am also the first to admit that some groups and some treatment counselors can really get on their high horse about the God thing. And in North America, it can be getting on their high horse about the Christian God thing,
Right.
and that doesn't work for a lot of people. And interestingly, the 12 steps and the 12-step history really went for this term higher power with the intention of it being more inclusive. And so I think the steps themselves are pretty inclusive, and there's always been a recognition that higher power can be anything as long as it's not you.
Yeah.
And sometimes, it could be the collective spirit you get from a group of people coming together for the same purpose. And in the new version of Trauma and the 12 Steps, I interview a very close friend of mine who does identify as atheist. And he talks about how he can still get benefit from a 12-step program because of really focusing on other aspects of the recovery. The potential problems are when certain groups, certain facilities, certain counselors can make people feel unwelcome because they're atheist and try to change them. So a lot of it is, yeah, there's some inherent benefits in the program that can get turned into faults when you have people just be a little too rigid about it. And then another criticism that can come up is how the steps use words like powerless and character defects and some other things that can feel outdated or triggering. And I talk about some of these issues in a little more detail in Trauma and the 12 Steps, but I'll summarize my position here as saying, change the language. That a principle of trauma focused, trauma informed care is that there's always a modification. So if a certain phrase isn't sitting well with you, maybe notice what that phrase is bringing up. use hopefully a more trauma-informed sponsor or a trauma-focused counselor to pick apart what it's bringing up in you, but maybe ask if there's another phrase you can use. So for example, this phrase character defects that is traditionally used in step 6 of the 12 steps. The Workaholics Anonymous program, for instance, will just call it negative coping skills, or the things we learned how to do to survive that may, yes, end up being maladaptive or getting in the way of our life. So there's always a way around. And I think too often we haven't looked at those alternatives or embraced those alternatives, which can make the 12 steps valuable and useful to folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So interestingly, since I too have done 12-step work, and I'm just thinking about the different like ways you can replace language. Cause I do know I do attend adult children of alcoholics meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things that they say is, right, if you have a hard time with the God or higher power or God of my understanding, right, it's the good orderly direction, GOD, right? Like, and I'm like, okay, that right, for people who might be triggered by that from any number of reasons in their past, that like, I was like, oh yeah, that feels cool. That feels like a good like replacement kind of thing.
Right.
So, yeah.